So we're continuing in today's Mishna Yomi, and today we find ourselves in Parakeh, the 5th chapter of Maseches Demai, and we will be learning in Mirza Hashem Mishnayos Aleph and Beis. So Mishnah Aleph says as follows: Halokeach min hanachtun ketzad hu ma'aser. So interestingly enough, if one buys bread, now we're talking about again bread that was produced with Demai flour. So now I buy the bread, I have to take the necessary tithes from the bread. So how do you do it? Notol kidei trumas meiser v'chalas. Remember again, it's important to know, we've said this already, that when separating separating tithes from Demai, one doesn't have to separate out Truma Gidola. And the reason for that is because we assume that even Ami Ha'aretz separate out Truma Gidola for the Kohen. So one doesn't have to do that. So what does one do? The first thing is you mark off a piece of the loaf for Trumas Meiser. Trumas Meiser is 1/100th of the loaf, and ultimately Chala. Chala is 1/48th of the loaf. Va'omer, and a person says, Echad mimea mimashi yeshkan hareze b'tzad maser. Person should say that 1/100th of this entire loaf, right? He demarcates a part of it, and he says 1/100th of this entire loaf is considered to go ahead and be Meiser Rishon, and again on one side of the demarcation, Usha'ar Meiser Samachlo, and ultimately again the rest of Meiser Rishon. Right, the rest of Meiser Rishon, in other words, remember again, the other 9/100ths, ultimately again is also designated as Meiser Rishon. Again, that's on the other side of the demarcation, we'll call it. Zeh sha'asisi ma'aser asay trumas meiser alav. Then again we say that ultimately again, the 10th, right, the 10th that I took on the first side, right, that ultimately again is made into Trumas Meiser for the rest of the Meiser Rishon that's on the other side. Vashar Chala, and the rest ultimately again is designated as Chala. So here again, the Mishnah is mamish getting into the technicalities of how to actually separate out the Demai tithes from the loaf. Umeiser Sheni, Bitzvono Bidromo, and ultimately again he goes, now again, this is all the recitation that he's making. See, Meiser Sheni ultimately again should be designated on the northern side of the loaf or on the southern side of the loaf, and again with Meiser Sheni, Umechulal al Hamos. Now the Meiser Sheni piece, you just simply go ahead and what? You just simply deconsecrate that onto money. Ultimately, the loaf becomes permitted for consumption. The money must be taken to Yerushalayim to be spent on food. Incredible. That's Mishnah Aleph. So again, just a technical Mishnah getting into how one is supposed to tithe Demai. Mishnah Beis says as follows: Harotz lahafish truma u'trumas meiser ba'achos. So now we're transitioning a little bit. At this point in time, again, the Mishnah is talking about not Demai, but what we call Tevel. Tevel, remember again, is produce that definitely has not been tithed. Right? I picked it from the field. It definitely has not been tithed. That's called Tevel. How do you tithe Tevel? Now this is talking about a person who wants to tithe and save time. So he wants to separate out Truma and Trumas Meiser at the same time. So what does he do? Notal echad mishloshim v'shalosh ushlish. So ultimately, again, he marks off on the loaf, right? Literally, again, 3/100ths of, I'm sorry, this is actually not a loaf, excuse me. Here it's Tevel. So here, by the Tevel case, we're talking about, let's say, a pile of grain, right? So whereas the first case, the previous Mishnah, we were talking about where he bought a loaf of Demai bread. How does he go ahead and separate out the different pieces? In this case, I have a pile of wheat that is Tevel, a pile of grain that's Tevel. How do I separate out? So number one, Notal echad mishloshim v'shalosh ushlish. You take out 1/300th of the pile. And what do you say? Va'omer, echad mimea mima sheyeshkan. So first I say 1/100th of the pile. Hareze b'tzad ze chulin. Ultimately, again, is set aside as chulin. Vashar truma al hakol. And the rest, ultimately, again, in other words, the 2/100ths of the pile, ultimately, again, is separated as Truma. Now, here's what's interesting. So, the 2/100ths of the piles become Truma. Umea chulin sheyeshkan, and ultimately, again, now remember, at this point in time, a person has taken care of the Truma obligation. Now, a person has to go ahead and take care of Meiser Rishon and Trumas Meiser. So, what do? Umea chulin sheyeshkan, and remember again, the 100th of the pile that I originally set aside as chulin, hareze b'tzad ze meiser, ultimately again is designated on one side of the demarcated area as meiser rishon, ushar meiser samuchlo, and the rest of the Meiser Rishon ultimately again will be on the other side. Zesha Asisi Meiser Asui Trumas Meiser Alav. Ultimately, again, the section that I just made as part of Meiser Rishon is made into Trumas Meiser for the rest of the Meiser Rishon. Meiser Sheni b'tzvona b'dromo, and again in the pile you go ahead and you designate Meiser Sheni on either the northern side of the pile, the southern side of the pile, umechulal al hamaos, and ultimately again the Meiser Sheni itself can be deconsecrated onto money, with the money being taken to Yerushalayim and spent on food items. All right, shkayach everyone. It's a little bit of a technical couple of Mishnayos. We'll stop over here, and we look forward to continuing Mishnayos Gimel and Dalet tomorrow. Have a great day.